Welcome to the Bronchiectasis and NTM 360 podcast, where we're here to share valuable insight from leading health experts, heartwarming stories from people living with bronchiectasis and NTM lung disease, and the latest in health research and treatment. Please subscribe, follow us on social media, and visit bronchiectasis and NTM360.org to learn more. Just a quick note before we get started. This podcast series is intended for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Please consult with your medical provider if you have any questions. Welcome to the Bronchiectasis and NTM 360 podcast. My name is Alyssa Dittner, Assistant Director of Bronchiectasis and NTM Education and Community and Respiratory Therapist. Joining us today will be Medical Director of Bronchiectasis and NTM 360, Dr. Timothy Aksamit. Dr. Aksamit is a leading pulmonologist and world-renowned for his research and forward thinking in diagnosis and treatment. He serves as a consultant and professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and is the former chairman of the U.S. Bronchiectasis and NTM Research Registry and is triple board certified in internal critical care and pulmonary disease. Dr. Aksamit, we are so thrilled to have you here today to come and celebrate World NTM Day.
Well, first, let me say, Alyssa, it's really great to be with you and our listeners today. This is a very exciting time to be involved in the NTM, which for those of you who may not be so familiar with this, stands for N, non-tuberculous mycobacteria. So NTM is non-tuberculous mycobacteria. I would give you just a little bit of a background, make sure that we're on the same page. There's lots of organisms that are everywhere in our environment. We don't live in a bubble. We don't live in a sterile environment. These are organisms that are everywhere in our soil and our water. We understand that there are different types of organisms. There's different groups. There are groups of bacteria, things like strep and staph and Pseudomonas that you've heard about, regular bacteria, and then mold and fungi all around us, and then naturally occurring viruses all around us called phages. And then there's a group of organisms or germs called mycobacteria. The most infamous is tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, or TB, but this is everything else other than tuberculosis. And in contrast to tuberculosis, this is not considered a communicable disease, but it is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's in every town. It's in every city. It's in every state. It's on every continent, and it's on of this planet. So it is completely ubiquitous. And one of the first things I'd like to share with listeners is that this is something that no matter how hard we try or what we do, there's not a chance that we're going to be able to minimize or mitigate all the exposure to these organisms. So we need to work in a way that we kind of manage this.
You have an extensive background. I would love for you to tell us your story about how you developed a passion for bronchiectasis and NTM lung disease.
As far as my story, I would share with you that this is an infection, if you will, or a group of organisms that have always caught my interest, both in the NTM as well as the TB worlds. I was involved very early on in something called hot tub lung, which is almost an allergic sensitivity to these NTM organisms. And as a result of this, had patients become very ill, but then could be very well treated and recover fully from this. And my only point is that as I began to be involved in this in a deeper way, I've gotten to interact with patients in particular who are really an inspiration. And shout out to all of those of you that have been involved in this space or are patients or are caregivers of patients with NTM lung disease. Your interest, your enthusiasm, your advocacy is an inspiration, certainly for me on a personal note, as well as for my colleagues that work in this area. So again, it's my honor and privilege to be able to walk this journey with you as we're starting to understand more and uncover really a great deal of information and understanding about what NTM lung disease is, where it comes from, and how we can effectively manage this.
That's great. I think that it is overwhelming to see all of the support groups that are out there and all the interaction and how eager people are to learn more about this lung disease and really what they can do. to help themselves and to get better and improve and spread awareness, which is so important. I would just like to know what is or who is at risk? Who is at risk for developing this lung disease? You said that it was everywhere. It's in all sorts of environments. So who would be the people who should be on the lookout?
Well, Alyssa, what we know so far about NTM lung disease, and this is the mycobacteria with infections that affect just the lungs. There are other groups of individuals that sometimes can get this in other parts of the body, but I'm going to restrict my comments to just the lung issue for this. Because it is ubiquitous, we understand that we're all exposed to it. It's interesting that what we've come to appreciate and learn about this is that as we get a little bit older, and usually an inflection point around our fifth, sixth, seventh decade, the incidence and prevalence of this and how common it goes up. And it's interesting, especially in the U.S. and North America, that it appears to affect those that are women more so than men by no fault of yours. It's not associated with smoking or specific activities or things that you've done or travels that you've done, and for the most part. And so this is something that we're still not quite 100% certain exactly how this occurs. There's a great deal of research trying to look at why individuals that get this. We think that this is not related to your immune system being out of whack. When there have been very sophisticated tests, we sometimes find very subtle changes of the immune system, but not enough to explain an immune problem. That is to say, people that have immune problems usually have lots of other kinds of infections as well, which individuals with NTM lung disease don't get. And likewise, the good news is that this NTM lung disease almost always stays within the lungs. That's the good news. And the bad news, of course, is it's in the lungs and we need to do something about this. And so you say, well, what are we going to do? But I want to give reassurance to patients if and when you do have a diagnosis of lung disease in most instances, that this is by no fault yours. It's not because you've done something, gone somewhere, been exposed to secondhand smoke. And I would share with you maybe one exception to this, and that is there are some individuals with existing emphysema or other kinds of lung disease, such as cystic fibrosis or other kinds of lung problems that can at times be exposed and then become infected with NTM. But the overwhelming majority of individuals, especially in the US and North America, acquire this by no fault of theirs. So I encourage patients not to feel guilty to say, oh, gee, if I just did this or that, or I didn't have this exposure or activity, I wouldn't have gotten this. And that's not the case. Having said that, I'll go back to my initial experience with this with something called hot tub lung. And for those of you who are familiar with hot tubs that are filled oftentimes with water that have disinfecting systems involving chlorine, bromine, or ozone, there's held at a relatively high temperature and it sits there. And if these organisms get into the water, that's a great place that they like to grow. That is to say, the temperature, the water is very favorable for these organisms to grow. And again, in the environment, the organism is generally found in water and soil. So those are the two targets that we try to pay attention to as to where those exposures may come from. And that sometimes we can do things in a very common sense way to mitigate some of that exposure. But in most instances, if there's some concern, we would ask that patients not get exposed to hot tubs, saunas, something that's of high temperature and has a lot of moisture to it. So that would be the first step here.
So even though hot tubs are treated with all of those chemicals, that is what makes it more at risk for people to develop NTM?
That's exactly right. And an excellent point, Alyssa. And in fact, the organism group carries a label of acid-fast bacilli, or AFB. And that acid-fast bacilli indicates the fastidious nature of these germs and how they resist temperatures and to a large extent like to thrive at these increased temperatures in what otherwise would be considered very adverse environments for most other organisms.
So you mentioned a little bit about traveling, and it wasn't because people were traveling to different areas, but one thing that I love to do when I travel is to go swimming. So trying to avoid the hot tubs, but indoor swimming pools, would you say those pose equal risk?
Yeah, so that's a very controversial issue. And what I would first start out and say that certainly free water bodies, things like oceans, rivers, lakes, for the most part, do not carry a substantial risk or worry as far as any NTM exposures. On the other side of the spectrum is just as you've indicated, if you are out and whether it's for a personal exposure in a household or in a community center or hotel or wherever you're traveling, hot tubs, because of the temperature and the moisture, is a great place for these germs to grow. Swimming pools, there have been some conflicting data. In some instances, there has been a risk of potential exposure to NTM with some swimming pools, and in other epidemiological studies, there's been absolutely no risk of swimming pools, especially outdoor swimming pools. So as a matter of practice, I generally share with patients, especially if it's an outdoor pool, that's generally not a problem, but I would stay away from any associated hot tub that may go along with that pool. I think it becomes really important for us as we start to think about what activities I want to do or not, to do those things that bring meaning and purpose to our life, that allow us to interact with those around us and our relationships. And if swimming's part of that, I think that unless there are very strong indications otherwise, I generally encourage patients to engage in those relationships. And if that means sometimes being in a pool, especially an outdoor pool, to go ahead with that.
Yeah, I think that's really important that people understand that we're not trying to take away their hobbies, but we're just trying to give words of advice and just different ways to think about where you can get exposed to these things. So I love that you had mentioned that.
And that's another great opportunity for us. And in that same way, just as you pointed out, Alyssa, about hobbies, would be the whole experience with gardening. And again, as mentioned, that one of the other reservoirs for these germs is in the soil. And so with particularly dusty and dirty environments, we know that we have at least the potential to have an increased exposure. So for us, and our patients and any of you listening that enjoy gardening, that enjoy having flowers and vegetables and other types of things where you like to get your hands dirty, we want you to engage in that. But if it's a dusty environment and you're working with dirt, that might be one of the times that you'd want to wear a mask. And if you wear a mask, we would generally recommend a mask that would adequately protect you, and that would involve an N95 or a K95 mask. So again, if gardening, whether it be with flowers or vegetables, indoor or outdoor, but working with dirt, by all means, we wouldn't want you to give that up. On the other hand, to take precautions would be a very simple and reasonable thing to do to minimize exposure.
Yeah, I think that it's really good to mention too, that includes lawn mowing, because we know that that creates a lot of dust and debris.
Right.
And so just wearing an N95, using that type of protection while you're mowing the lawn as well.
And that's a great point, Alyssa. And, it's interesting. And again, I want to also emphasize the same point that because we know there's a potential for these organisms to be everywhere in soil and water, doesn't always mean that that's the case. So, for example, again, because the organism has a potential to be in an environment, and even if it is, may or may not correlate with what that means for whether I, as a patient, are at risk to acquire this. And this brings up this whole notion that we want to do simple, reasonable, common sense things, but not get to the point where it restricts us, causes isolation, and just contributes to what can oftentimes be really a burden of stress and worry, because we need to have our relationships in our life, and whether it's our patients that interact with their family, their friends, their other community people. I really encourage patients to embrace those activities that bring meaning and purpose, and to engage with some common sense precautions, but also to engage with those around you to really enhance that. Your mental health is an incredibly important part of all of this, and we can't diminish the importance and rely just on the potential exposure to germs in the environment.
Is there any way to test your soil? Is there a way to, if you're going to be gardening at a certain location, can you test your soil for this stuff? Or is that kind of pointless? Or even with your pipes, could you test your water?
Yeah, so the short answer is it's possible. And we've done this for research purposes, but I've gotten into the practice of not doing this routinely. And the point is that if it does not show up, doesn't guarantee that that can't be a source. And likewise, if it does show up, it also doesn't mean that that's the source or the problem for those of us that have NTM lung disease. So we're left in a kind of a conundrum, if you will, in a position where we've got all these germs around us. And what does that mean? And the answer is, I don't know. So again, I get back to, from a common sense standpoint, get rid of the hot tub, get rid of the dry or wet sauna. If you want to take showers, which hopefully our partners all want us to take showers so we don't just smell awful all the time, we have to, again, do reasonable things. Sometimes some of the environmental things from a residential standpoint for water will be to increase our water heater temperature. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Joe Falkenham at Virginia Tech, an expert in environmental NTM worldwide, makes the recommendation to increase the water heater temperature to 135 degrees or more. To also think about large droplet shower heads so there's not a fine mist that gets aerosolized everywhere. In some instances, we also encourage patients, if you really want to soak your shower heads in a vinegar or a solution once a month, that may also decrease some of the exposure. I have a tendency not to encourage or go automatically to putting filtering systems into residential water sources without having good reason that that's one of the problems, because we can spend a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and a lot of money doing mitigation strategies, and that may or may not be helpful to us. So again, this is a conversation to talk to your physicians, either your pulmonary physicians, your ID physicians. There's a lot of information in the support groups. It's hugely important that we share this information, that we educate each other. On the other hand, we also need to be mindful that we have to take a practical approach. And right at the moment, there's not enough data to say that this absolutely should be done. There's also lots of interest that comes up about what to do with tap water or drinking water. And that too is controversial in that there's not a lot of data to suggest that that has a direct link to acquisition of NTM lung disease or will prevent this from coming back. Having said that, if we look hard enough, sometimes we'll find this. In most instances, and this goes back to our experience with respiratory therapy, and maybe you, Alyssa, can comment on this about cleaning equipment. We do ask that patients not use tap water or regular bottled water for their cleaning of their equipment, because there could potentially be NTM organisms or other organisms in that. And many of the equipment manufacturers will give very specific recommendations on how best to clean those pieces of equipment in that way. And I don't know if you'd like to share from your experience in respiratory, but I know that this is a concern that so many patients have.
Yes, I'd love to. Unfortunately, there is not a standard way to clean all equipment. I do recommend people clean their equipment daily and always resort to manufacturer instructions on how to properly clean. With that being said, disassembling the devices, such as your aerobica, acapella, any sort of oscillating vibratory prep devices, is going to be your first step. Washing them in a dishwasher as possible, just making sure you secure all the pieces in a basket or on the top rack. And of course, making sure that you're not washing them with dirty dishes. And you can also use just warm soapy water, and you would want to wash that and agitate that for about 15 minutes. But the caveat with that is you need to boil your water first and then allow it to cool.
Some of us are very, very passionate about as to what happens with our water sources that say come out of the refrigerator door that have charcoal sources. Sometimes the charcoal, whether it be in a refrigerator door or other types of filtering system, is a great place for these little germs to glob onto. So a charcoal filtering system doesn't in any way help protect us from at least these organisms, and we would discourage that if you wanted to potentially minimize exposure.
So do you think using bottles of water would be the best bet, or boiling the water before drinking?
Yeah. So again, that's a great question. I know something that people think and talk about a lot. I would caution individuals that many of the bottled water that we encounter when we go to the store is water that comes out of someone's faucet somewhere. And so there's not necessarily any greater safety there than anywhere else. If you wanted to take the most cautious approach, then we would boil the water. As far as that would be a way that you said, if I wanted to make sure that there were no NTM organisms in the water that I was drinking, if you boiled the water, for sure we would not have the organisms there. I would caution again, no tap water for sure, and no regular bottled water. If it's truly spring water, that's less likely to be a risk, but that may also vary depending on the source and how that's acquired.
Dr. Aksamit, for those who are listening, what is one takeaway that you want to ensure that people leave with?
So summertime is a great time to really engage in those things that bring meaning and purpose to our lives. Engage with your family, with your friends, with those others that you find meaning with. And so to be active, to enjoy the outdoors is, in my opinion, vitally important. It helps us from a mental health standpoint, makes us feel better. That's part of our overall wellness. And so being active, and I hesitate, as many of my patients have heard me say, to label this as exercise. We're not training for the Olympics. We're not doing really intense kinds of things, but we want to be active. We want to keep moving, and we want to do things that we label as airway clearance, so that if we have mucus in our lungs, we want to cough that out. Being active is really helpful, not only from a lung standpoint, but from a general wellness standpoint. It helps us with cardiovascular risk management, with balance, with strength, and with stress management. And so to do all of that is really important to stay active. And summertime in particular is one of those times when we want to get out, engage with those around us, find those things that you really enjoy to do, and not hesitate, but to manage that.
Thank you so much for that takeaway, Dr. Aksamit. As you mentioned, mental health is extremely important, and we don't want people to feel trapped in their homes. We want people to get out there and explore and do all the things that you love. Of course, like you mentioned, we can't mitigate all those risks, but perhaps we can just help guide people to take some precautions to help continue to do the things that you love. Dr. Aksamit, you specifically mentioned using an N95 mask while gardening, boiling and cooling batches of water for drinking, using an outdoor pool instead of an inside pool, and steering clear of all those hot tubs and saunas. Those are really great recommendations. Bronch and NTM 360 does offer a support group that meets every second Wednesday of the month that really just helps to pour back into you and let you know that you're not alone. They also offer free downloadable materials to increase communication with your provider and for you to help identify early signs and symptoms. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Aksamit. We are really learning so much about how to optimize our summer. Just happy World NTM Day, everybody.
Yes, happy World NTM Day, and to all of you, you remain an inspiration to all of us who work in this area, taking care of patients that are doing clinical research and even basic science research. So keep up that advocacy, look for each other, no apologies, advocate for yourself, engage in the education, and to tap into some of these resources that Alyssa and these other sites have made available to you. Oftentimes you help us understand and inform us and your other physicians and providers. We're here to walk this journey together, and it can't be done without your continued engagement. And for that, I'm grateful, and I wish everyone a great summer. Be active, engage with those around you that, again, bring meaning and purpose, and embrace that.
Thank you for tuning in to the Bronchiectasis and NTM 360 podcast. We hope that you found today's episode helpful and inspiring. You can stay connected by joining our online community, following our social media, and visiting our website for more resources. And of course, subscribe to this podcast and join us next time for more insight, stories, and tips to help you live well with bronchiectasis and NTM lung disease. Until then, thanks for listening and be well.